Rabbi Jim of Shiloh Kahal. Across my 4 decades of time in the faith, I have heard it, I've seen it, I've lived it. There's been some confusion about what that Last Supper was that Yahushua or Jesus spent with his Talmidim or disciples. Many will just insist that it cannot be the Passover or the Pesach meal, that he did not observe the Pesach meal. Now, I get why there's confusion. There's church doctrine creating confusion. And then in the gospel accounts, they know that the Yehudim then are celebrating the preparation day, the next day, the day of his crucifixion. So it's hard to reconcile. How did he just have the Passover when the Yehudim or the Jews are getting ready to celebrate the Passover? So I think the reconciliation has been that, well, Jesus didn't celebrate the Passover, and I think that is the error. In fact, just yesterday, from a leader in the Torah communities, I heard him say that it was on the 13th day of that first month that Yahushua broke bread and drank that wine and had that meal with his disciples. And that cannot be. It just cannot be if he walked out Torah or the law of Moses. It cannot be, because if it was a Passover, he had to celebrate it on the 14th. The Passover, the Pesach, the Passover lamb had to be slaughtered and killed on the 14th. They had to eat their dinner, that Passover meal, on the 14th with unleavened bread, bitter herbs. And then the next day would have been the 15th, and they would have entered the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where it would have been a Sabbath. If he's going to be keeping Torah, it had to be the 14th. So the confusion is, I think the first thing that we need to settle, though, is did he actually keep Passover or not? Or was it some other meal, as others are talking about? Well, I don't think it's possible, because none of the gospel accounts show it that way. They are all definitive. And let me visit them and show you what I mean. Now, I've been reading for years out of the restored name versions, and I've been spending more time in the Yah scriptures than anything else when I'm online, and the Hallelujah scriptures when I'm reading in just, when I'm reading. And I know that we're going to be using some words that are not customary to the English translation, so I will revisit those English translations. But I'm working from the Yah scriptures because it's a literal translation. And in the Yah scriptures, Yahushua is called Yahushua, not Jesus. The Passover is called Pesach. So don't let that overly confuse you, because I will go show you the Passover and the point of this video in the King James Version and the NASB in just a second here, which would be two mainstream, ideally literal translations as well. So let me show you what I've done here. So I'm in the Yah scriptures. I've gone to the first gospel account, Matthew, Metiyahu, and I've put the word search. Let me also make this bigger here. I've got a word search here for Pesach, and let's just go see what it says, what it gives us for Pesach. So starting with the first chapter of Matthew, the first Pesach we get is in chapter 26:2, when Yahushua says to his Talmidim, which are his disciples, and he says, after 2 days the Pesach takes place, and the ben of Adam is to be delivered up to be impaled. So we know that he's referencing the Pesach here, the Passover. And then on the first of Matzah, which I understand is confusing because everybody thinks this is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but that's not the first day that they eat unleavened bread. I will show you at the end of this, again, the timeline of that Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread week, so that you can, according to Exodus and Leviticus, so that you can see what they're referencing here. But we know the first of Matzah came, and then they came to Yahushua, which is what this is, it's Yahushua, saying to him, where do you want us to go to prepare to eat the Pesach, the Passover? So they're not confused. They know they're getting ready to go eat Passover, not a different meal. And then Yahushua says to them, go into the city of a certain man, and tells them to tell him that I'm to observe the Pesach. So Yahushua was saying, I'm going to observe the Pesach at your house with my Talmidim. So then the Talmidim did as Yahushua ordered and prepared the Pesach according to Matthew. Later, let's go see what else it says here. Okay, so that's really it for Matthew. That those are the three, but there's no question in Matthew that they thought they were going to be going and preparing the Pesach, and they did what they did, and they prepared the Pesach. And when evening came, and let me just say here this is not pulled by Pesach, but it says when evening came, he sat down with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, "Truly, one of you is going to deliver me up." So they came that evening as they would, because that is the understanding of Pesach. You're going to slaughter the lamb during the daylight hours between the evenings, prepare it because you have to eat it that evening and eat it that night, over the course of that night. And that's exactly what they did. They went and prepared the Pesach, and then when evening came, he came and sat down with the 12, and they ate the Passover. All right, let's keep going. So we're in Mark now, chapter 14, and here's where he's referencing now the Pesach and the Matzah was after 2 days, which we just saw in Matthew as well. And then here they are showing up, the Talmudim showing up, and on the first day of Matzah, which would be the first day, which is Passover, because they eat unleavened bread that night, first day of Matzah, when they were slaughtering the Pesach, meaning killing the Pesach lamb, which they have to do on the 14th day, his Talmudim said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare for you the Pesach?" And he sends them out into the city, and he says, "Go to the place, where the guest room is, and tell them I'm to eat the Pesach with my Talmudim." And his Talmudim went out and came into the city, found it as he said, and then they prepared the Pesach. So they clearly prepared the Pesach in Mark. And then evening having come, he came with the 12, and they sat and ate the Pesach. In Mark, how they understood they were preparing the Pesach or the Passover. Now here is Luke. We've moved into Luke here. And we got some references to Pesach in the early stages. But here is where we get into that last week of his life again, in the resurrection week, and the festival of Matzah drew near, which is called Pesach. And the day of Matzah came when the Pesach had to be slaughtered. So here is there's no question. They're talking about the Pesach again, and that first day of unleavened bread, which is Passover. And he said, not the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover. I'll show you in a second here. And then he goes into, this was Kepha, Peter and John, Kepha and Yohanan, Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Pesach for us to eat." And they did. And they went to the master of the house and said, "Show us the guest room where I might eat the Pesach with my Talmudim." And he shows them a large upper room. And going there, they found it as he said, and they prepared the Pesach. There's no question about what they're preparing. And when the hour had come, he sat down and they ate. And in the midst of that conversation in Luke, he says, "With desire, I have desired to eat this Pesach with you before my suffering." Here we are through the 3 gospel accounts. And let me see if there are any more here in Luke. Okay, and then we enter John. When we get to the Gospel of John, we do have some references to the Pesach earlier in the Gospel account. So this is, what is this? This is chapter 2, and they do talk about some of the earlier Pesach festivals and Pesach. Here's chapter 2 again, when he was in Jerusalem for the Pesach earlier in his ministry. Here is another reference to the Pesach being near during his ministry. But here is where we get to the Pesach account, which is chapter 11 of John, where we get to the Pesach account where the Pesach of Yehudim was near, and many went out into the country, from the country up to Jerusalem, and before the Pesach to Kadash themselves. And it was during that period of time that they were there that they heard of Lazarus and Yahushua and went out to Bethany to meet him. And then we had the triumphant entry where Yahushua came riding in on the foal of a donkey. But then we get in chapter 12, accordingly 6 days before the Pesach Yahushua, 6 days before the Pesach came to Bethania, where Eleazar, which is Lazarus, was, who had died and whom he had raised from the dead. And so then this is the account with Miriam anointing him. But now the Pesach, okay, forgive me, let me just see if I can get to the next version. Accordingly, the Pesach. Okay, so before the festival of the Pesach, Yahushua, knowing that his hour had come and that he should move out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. Okay, and then supper taking place, and that's all he really says. The devil enters from Kerioth, and he went up to deliver him. But he rose from the supper, which we know is, though, the Pesach that he just ate, according to the other three gospel accounts. And then we have chapter after chapter of what he shared during that last Pesach meal with him. Okay, so there really is no, let me see if there are any more accounts in John to the Pesach. Here is, I think, part of what confuses people, because here is, when, forgive me, I know this is bouncing around. This is when they've led him to Caiaphas. After they led him to Caiaphas, then they led him to the palace, but they didn't want to, let's see if I can find it here very quickly, denied it. Yeah, here they led Yahushua from Caiaphas to the palace, and it was early, and they themselves did not go in, because lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Pesach, or the Passover. So I think this is part of the confusion, because the Yehudim were just getting ready to enter their preparation day so that they could eat the Pesach that night. They're an entire day behind the day that Yahushua celebrated. And I get that can be confusing until you begin to understand what's going on with the calendar issues, which, you don't get from just casual reading of the scriptures. You recognize the problem, but you don't know how to reconcile it until you start pulling in more data, because you have to understand what was taking place in those days related to the calendar. I'm getting ready to make a video related to the calendar that I'll reference you to, that if you want to know a little more about what's happening with the calendar at this point in time. But there's where some of the confusion comes in. But that Yahushua was keeping the Passover is really unmistakable. Okay, so for those who don't really feel comfortable with the restored name versions of, say, the Yah scriptures or the Hallelujah scriptures, etc., let's go to the King James Version and the NASB, because these are trusted versions within the Christian community. So here I am in the King James Version, and at Matthew chapter 26, verse 2, it reads, Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified. When we get later on, when they're at, the Talmidim approached him, or the disciples approach him, say, where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover. Here are the instructions to them. This is chapter 26, verse 18, 17, and 18. I will keep the Passover at thy house with thy disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. So clearly, Passover in Matthew in the King James Version. Let's go to Mark. And that's Passover to the other side. After 2 days, and here's Mark chapter 14, after 2 days was the feast of Passover and of unleavened bread, and etc. So there's referencing the Passover, and here they are approaching him. This again is still Mark 14. And the disciples come to him and say, here the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare that thou mayest eat the Passover? And he sends them off to say, to the gentleman who has the guest chamber, says, this is where I'm going to eat the Passover. I'm sorry, I should just read it as it is. I don't mean to confuse it a little bit, but just you can see that they're referencing the Passover. Go to your King James Version, go to any version you want to read, and you'll see that they're referencing the Passover over and over again here in Mark as well. And we know that they're trying to go kill the lamb and prepare the Passover meal. That's why they're talking about having to, let's see, when they killed the Passover, they had to kill the Passover. So they had to kill the Passover. They were going to be slaughtering the Passover lamb and preparing that meal. Okay, that's King James and Mark. Let's go to Luke. Is this Luke? No, we're still in Mark. Okay, so here's some references in Luke, and here we are. Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. And then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. So we know that the Passover has to be killed, that the disciples were trying to kill the Passover to go and prepare the Passover meal, that they may eat the Passover meal. And then Jesus gives them the instructions, again, go into this. This is the same thing that I just skipped over in Mark. Behold, when you are entered into the city, there shall be a man meeting you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. And you shall say unto the good man of the house, the master saith unto thee, where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he shall show you a large upper room furnished. There make ready. And they went and found it just as they said, and they made ready the Passover. And then later he says, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. So this is the King James Version. And it's being very evident that it's the Passover that he was eating. Let's go to the New American Standard and see what it says. Again, I'm doing a search for the word Passover here. And let's go to the first occurrence of it. Here's Matthew 26:2. You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion. And let's go to the next one. And then in verse 17 of chapter 16, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and said, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house. The disciples did as Jesus directed him, and they prepared the Passover. No question that he's eating the Passover. Let's, okay, so here's Mark. Here's the Mark version. Now the Passover and unleavened bread were 2 days away. And when we get to verse 12, on the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, they were killing the sacrifice, as you need to do on the 14th day. His disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sends them into the city, go into the city, and whoever enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he himself will show you the large upper room prepared for us there. And the disciples went out and came to the city, found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. No question what meal he was eating that night that he spent with his disciples. And here's the Luke version, chapter 22, verse 1. Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. And so he considered and began seeking. Then came the first day in verse 7 here. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So this is kind of very key. The first day of unleavened bread. You got to understand, and I'm going to show you here in just a second. First day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed. That's the 14th day. There's no question when you are, according to Torah, that you are to kill the Passover lamb on the 14th day, which is also a day of unleavened bread, which is the first day of unleavened bread they are referencing here. Because the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is not on the 14th. It is not the same day that the lamb is sacrificed. It's the next day. But the first time that you eat unleavened bread is there on the 14th day, which is the day you are to kill the Passover during the daylight hours, between the evenings in the day of the 14th, eating it that night. And that's exactly what they did. And Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go and prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it. And so sends them to this is the same story over and over again. Where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And they left and found everything just as he said, and they prepared the Passover. And then in verse 15, he says to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This is just before they go out to the garden, Mount of Olives, and he is arrested and taken away to suffer, just like he said. So I suppose that you could find some translations in some versions that would confuse the issue more. But if you stay with the major translations, I'm pretty confident that every single one of them will show you that last meal, they will reference it as the Passover or some version of the Passover. Now let's quickly go and revisit Exodus to affirm what takes place on the Passover, that day that they're referencing here. Well, in Exodus 12, I'm not going to read it to you, but I'll just outline it for you. So they have to select on the 10th day of the first month, they have to select a lamb and keep it until the 14th day. And then the assembly is to kill it between the evenings on the 14th day. And then they are to eat the flesh that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread. Okay, and then after that, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So here is the command. Here is, if you look at the timeline, here is, if you follow this across, this is the, what would be the Hebrew calendar. This would be day 1 of the week, which would have been for the 5th day of that first month. And then you would have day 2 would have been the 6th day, day 3, the 7th day, day 4 would have been so here is the 10th of that first month. Let me get my pencil. Here's the 10th day of that first month. We're there to set aside the lamb. And then they go, and here is the 14th day of that month, which will always be on day 3 of the week, which is a Tuesday, always, which I'll explain in another video. But if you're going to go by the Zadok calendar or the Enoch calendar, that would be consistent, the 3rd day of the week each year, year after year. And on the 14th day, though, there's no question, this is the day you are to kill the Pesah between the evenings and eat that night the Pesah with unleavened bread. There's no question. You can't do it on the 13th and you can't do it on the 15th. So you can't kill the lamb on the 13th and eat it on the 14th. You can't kill the lamb on the 14th and eat it on the 15th. Let me show this to you in Leviticus very quickly, because it's the same thing. In Leviticus 23, when we get to the appointed times, that we're instructed, the Israelites were instructed that on the in the first month, on the 14th day between the evenings, is the Pesah to Yahweh. You are to kill the Pesah between the evenings and eat it at night with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. So there's no question that the Pesah needs to take place on the 14th. On the 15th day of this month is the festival of Matzah to Yahweh, and 7 days you are to eat unleavened bread, for a total of 8 days that you eat unleavened bread. The first day of that week is a Sabbath, and the 7th day of that week is a Sabbath. And what does that look like on a calendar? Here it is again, where we have them selecting a lamb on the 10th day of the month. And then we have the Passover coming on the 14th day of the month, when it is to be killed between the evenings, and you to eat it that night with unleavened bread. On the 15th, when the 15th starts, we begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a Sabbath, and we are to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So we go through 7 days, and then we have another Sabbath at the end of it. So there is no question, though, that the Passover needs to be prepared and eaten on the 14th. Same thing with the Exodus timeline. It all has to be done on the 14th. So if Yahushua is celebrating the Passover with his Talmidim, then he has to be doing it on the 14th day according to his calendar, his reckoning, which would be the correct reckoning because he's Messiah and he has to keep Torah exactly. Let's go to his timeline real quick. So here is the timeline of the last week of Messiah's life here. And here is the day that they approach him, which is defined in some of the gospel accounts as the first day of unleavened bread, but it was clearly the preparation day where the lamb had to be slaughtered. Forgive me, this is just to clarify this. This is an outline, a timeline of that last week of his life where we had the Passover, crucifixion, resurrection week. I'm sorry if I wasn't making that clear. But on the 14th, they approached the Messiah because they had to slaughter the lamb and prepare it to celebrate that Passover, which they did. They followed his instructions and they prepared it just as they were instructed, and that night they ate the Pesah meal. So there could be no question that the day that they were doing this had to be the 14th day on the calendar of his reckoning. There can be no question. Because he can't. If he celebrated it on the 13th, he didn't celebrate it according to Torah. He did not follow Torah. It can't be. And if he was eating it it just can't be. He had to be eating it on the 14th. So to finish that thought, if someone suggests that they were eating it on the 13th, then it has to be one of two things. Either it wasn't the Passover meal, it was some other meal, or he's failing to keep Torah. One of the two. It can't be both. Because if he's keeping Torah, he has to be doing it on the 14th, which makes all of this occurrence the 14th. And if that's the 14th, then you're going to have a hard time reconciling how the Yehudim were celebrating the next day, the day that he was being crucified, after he'd been arrested, already had the meal, been arrested, taken away, and then they are worried about how they're going to prepare for the Passover and how they're not going to want to, enter the palace so they're not defiled and can eat the Passover meal that night. So they're celebrating it a full day behind. And if they're following Torah, they cannot do it unless they're recognizing that next day as the 14th as well. This is the evidence that there were two calendars taking place. And there's plenty of other evidence that goes outside of these gospel accounts evidencing that there were two calendars in place. I will be showing you a video. We're going to bring in Rachel Ellier into this conversation and some other people that are involved in this, in the Qumran accounts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. as well. Okay, so let me show you one other thing before I close out this video, making the point that they had to be eating. I think it's very evident in the gospel accounts that they were eating the Passover, and that made that day the 14th, no question, and that is a separate day from the 14th that the mainstream Yehudim would have been keeping. There just can be no question. But let me also suggest that they had to be doing the preparation during the day. They cannot. I know that in the same confusion that all of this enters also comes the confusion of when a day begins, because if you're starting the day in the evening, more confusion, more problems, and it doesn't work. In fact, this entire topic of the Passover, handling of the Passover, is another one of the evidences of many evidences that the day cannot go from evening to evening. Let me go there now. Okay, hopefully you can follow this with me. Here is day 14. This is the command. You are to prepare, you are to kill the Passover on you're to kill the Passover on the 14th day, and you're to eat it that night on the 14th day. You have to kill the Passover and you have to eat it that night. How does that happen if the day starts at evening? Because the very first thing that happens then on a day 14 is you have sunset and evening. And by the time sunset and evening comes back around, because after the sunset and evening, we have the daylight, the dusk period, then we have night, then we have the sunrise, and then we have a daytime period. But before the sun goes down, when the sun goes down again, we've entered day 15. So if you're going to eat the Passover meal on day 14, you would have to eat it very first thing, which means that it would have had to have been prepared on the 13th, and that violates the instructions of Exodus and Leviticus. You can't have it. So if you're going to eat the meal on the 14th, you would have at evening, at night on the 14th, according to an evening to evening reckoning, you have to eat it the very first thing on the 14th day, which meant you had to prepare sometime before that, which would have put you on the 13th. If you were to stay with this and not prepare on the 13th, well, you can't eat it at night on the 14th if you're preparing on the 14th. Let's say that you do embrace this and you know you have to kill the lamb on the 14th, then you have from the sunset on day 14, which means you could kill the lamb over the evening hours. You could kill it at night if you want and keep it, but you have to eat it that night. I suppose you could also play a game where you have to kill the lamb and prepare it all right here at this moment, in the very, from the something related here in this little bit of time where the sunset happened, and then you eat it this night. That's possible, but that's not what we see evidenced in the gospel accounts or how it gets played out. Otherwise, you have to, and I think most people will not, from when I've heard this people trying to explain this, I don't see them trying to prepare it all very quickly. They end up preparing it on the 14th day here sometime, but then by the time they're eating it, by the time sunset comes around, they recognize that they are on day 15 and they've got a problem. But because they are commingling Pesach and the idea of unleavened bread, they pretty much just tie it all together and assume that thus eating on the 15th day is the same thing as eating it on the 14th day. And I just don't see how that can be. So hopefully you can see the problem with this reckoning. If you're going to go evening to evening, you have a problem because you're going to have to kill the lamb and prepare on the 13th day to eat it at night on the 14th. Or if you're going to kill the lamb during the 14th, you're going to have to kill it sometime between that sunset and it comes back around and you're eating here. But by the time it's nighttime, you're going to be eating it on the 15th. it's a problem. The only way you could make this work, and I've tried to play this game, it's been a little bit, but I've tried to play the game where, between the evenings would be something like when the sun starts to set, you've got to scramble and get the piece all slaughtered and prepared so that you can eat it that night. Maybe, and that's a possibility. But it's just, if you understand that that's just not how a day is reckoned. A day is reckoned from sunrise in the morning when it all comes up, as you would naturally expect. And this is how the 14th day plays out. Here's day 14. That, when you get up, this is the day you've been keeping the lamb, and this is the day from between the evenings. Here's the first evening. So you got sometime through here, you've got to slaughter, kill the lamb, and prepare it for dinner that night on the 14th. And then when the time comes, you are eating the piece. You're eating the piece all down here. It's quick, it's easy, it's succinct. It's exactly what we see played out over and over again. And then you're to eat it over the night, and you're not to leave anything till morning. But here the next day is the first day of unleavened bread, and it all just works. This is the Sabbath day. You don't really have to manufacture anything. You don't have to play any games. And when we get to the Passover timeline, this is exactly what we see played out as they seem to get up. It doesn't look like they're preparing at nighttime. They didn't scramble to go get it done. They had a whole day that they had to take to go and find out what they needed to do. They've got to kill the lamb. They approach Messiah and say, "What do you want us to do?" He gives them instructions. They go into town. I'm assuming it's not at night that they're going and finding the guy running around. It's all daytime. It seems so evident these are daytime events, but they go and they find the upper room. They go and prepare the meal. And then that night, that evening, when the time comes, Messiah with the rest of his Talmidim, his disciples, comes to eat the meal. It's exactly what we see played out here. So they go and prepare during the day for an evening meal that night. So we're not doing an evening to evening. If they had done an evening to evening, they'd have had to, as the sun was going down on the 13th, start preparing, because if they're going to eat on the 14th, they had to eat first thing. If they're going to eat at night on the 14th, because the first thing on an evening to evening reckoning, first thing you get is evening and night. And if to eat on the 14th, it's the first thing you got to do, and you would have to prepare on the 13th. Okay, so I'm just saying that it seems so evident that the gospel accounts of this Passover meal would also support a sunrise to sunrise reckoning of a day. All right. So let me finish up here. So just summarizing, it cannot be the Yahushua, Jesus, was keeping the Passover meal. It was not a different meal. It was the Passover meal. And if it was the Passover meal, he had to be celebrating it on the 14th. And if he was celebrating it on the 14th according to Torah, then he is celebrating it a day before the Yehudim were celebrating it, evidence of a second calendar. But that he was keeping it on the 14th and that he was keeping the Passover meal, I get the confusion. I know why there's confusion, because without more information, what else do you do with those gospel accounts? If you don't understand there are two calendars and that the Yehudim, and if you're giving more weight to the idea that the Yehudim knew what they were doing and were keeping it correctly at that point in time, and if you're going to take their calendar and their approach as your evidence of what really would have been the recognized Passover day, then you would have to find another explanation for what Yahushua just did if you're going to give primary weight to what the Yehudim were doing. But if you're going to give primary weight to what Yahushua was doing, what Jesus was doing, then you would know that he is keeping correct Torah. He is keeping correct Passover. He's keeping it on the 14th day, a day before the Yehudim, which tells you that you have two separate calendars. So Yahushua was keeping Passover. He was keeping it on the 14th, which was a different day than what the Yehudim were keeping it. All right. Well, thank you for your time. If you think what I'm sharing has value, then I invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and may you be Baruch.